As America celebrates its 250th birthday, it's a chance to reflect on the ideas that helped shape our nation. Nearly 250 years ago, the Declaration of Independence established the principles of equality, individual rights, and self-government. Those principles helped build a nation founded on freedom and opportunity. Here in North Dakota, they continue to shape the future we want to build for the next generation. Connect and learn more at afpnd.org.
This episode is presented by Recovery Centers of Montana.
If you or someone you know is struggling, getting help shouldn't feel out of reach.
Recovery Centers of Montana offers care across 6 locations, including inpatient facilities and outpatient clinics.
Step away from the noise and focus on getting your life back on track.
Learn more by calling 701-401-3000.
That's 701-401-3000.
The North Dakota oil and natural gas industry works here, and works here, and here, and even works here by creating 60,000 jobs statewide and generating billions of tax dollars annually to support our infrastructure, flood protection projects, and our schools. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities.
Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org.
This episode is presented by the Blue Rider.
Check out the Blue Rider in downtown Minot for a laid-back vibe and outdoor patio and 16 beers on tap.
They've got live music, trivia nights, and one of the deepest record collections around.
Plus fair prices, friendly faces, late-night favorites like grilled cheese and pizza.
The Blue Rider, serving Minot since 1994.
Good drinks, good music, good people.
You're listening to Plain Talk, the voice of North Dakota politics. I'm your host, Rob Port. If I sound distracted, it's because I've been busy covering this story all morning. I'm joined by my co-host, Chad Oban.
He's right of center, I'm left of center, both sides of the political spectrum.
I think it's cathartic. I think it's a necessary and proper debate. I'm glad we're having it.
And honestly, we have to do better.
Okay, I don't know why I'm getting blamed for this, right? Welcome to Plain Talk. We're going to be talking about a key legislative race, North Dakota. Democrats are energized. I was at the party's state convention. And by the way, my guest co-host today, Zach Ista, who's not going to be on the ballot. He's not seeking re-election. He is, what did he say in the show earlier this week? He is the lamest of lame ducks. That's his words, not mine. I'm not saying Democrat. That. I don't think that you're lame at all, Zach. But I feel like Democrats are energized. I want to temper that because I'm accountable for the sort of predictions that I make. I'm not predicting a blue wave in North Dakota. That being said, I think we're probably going to come into the legislative session next January, and we're going to see a larger Democratic minority than we have now. I think that's a very likely outcome. One race that I'm watching is in District 41, where the candidate is Dr. Tiongson. He's a pediatrician, a physician. Goes by the name Dr. T. And my first question for you, Chris, is can you say, "I pity the fool" for me?
Yeah, that's Mr. T, but...
That's Mr. T. All right. Yeah. Well, tell us, why'd you get in this race? What drew you into politics is a big leap. I mean, a lot of people don't. It's a big, all of a sudden you're in the spotlight. You got a lot of people talking to you. All of a sudden you got people showing up on your Facebook page, some of them not saying some very nice things about you. I talk to candidates all the time. It's nerve-wracking to do this. So what made you want to jump in and do this?
Well, I've always wanted to serve the community, and even when I was thinking about like what I wanted to do for my career, like at first I really just wanted to be a baseball player and be like
me too,
like David Concepcion. But easily I could tell, even by age 9, that was not going to happen. You know,
Willie Randolph for me, second baser of the Yankees. Yeah.
And so then, like, my dad's a doctor, my mom's a nurse, so that's what you do to serve people. And actually, if my parents are listening to this, I probably shouldn't say this, but I also thought about being a priest for a little bit too. But I really, really wanted to be a dad and a husband. So I became a pediatrician. That way I can take care of kids and teach and be ready for that next generation. And as I've seen over the years, almost 30 years in pediatrics now, there are so many things that are happening outside the exam room that parents and families really don't have control over that affect their health, like pollution, poverty, housing insecurity, food insecurity, racism, bullying, all that kind of stuff. And I felt like, I can have a greater impact helping the health of our community, working on public policy, as opposed to just one patient at a time in the exam room or one patient at a time in a hospital bed.
Pediatrician, most people like their pediatricians and often a lot. Not sure, like Rob alluded to, you're going to find out about their politicians, but you have a very unique perspective, both directly on healthcare policy, having, lived it as a provider for your career, but then as somebody that has to deal with a wide variety of patients. And as a pediatrician, you always have two patients. You have the child and their parent or guardian. How do you think as a citizen legislator, you're going to be able to leverage both your policy expertise in healthcare and then your career training in just relating to different people?
Yeah, I mean, that's something I do every day in pediatrics. I talk to families, some families I've never met before. They come in at a critical time or a really scary time, especially when I worked in the hospital, and being able to, build that rapport with them, understand, have empathy, and get to the root of what's going on, I think is very helpful and definitely transferable to public service. One of the tenets of pediatrics is prevention, and there's like three types of prevention: primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. So primary prevention is like vaccines and bike helmets and car seats and that kind of stuff. Secondary prevention would be like airbags and crumple zones in cars, right? So that once you do get into a crash, you try to minimize the amount of damage. And the tertiary would be having well-equipped critical access hospitals so that if after you do get into a crash and you're in an accident, then you can get your initial care there or go to a trauma center. I think the same things kind of apply to issues in society, like trying to prevent poverty by encouraging public education and fully supporting it. And then being able to provide special ed services for kids who need it in that secondary group. And then, being able to have great opportunities for kids to go either to college or trade school or go straight into the workforce. I think that is what's going to make North Dakota stronger.
Chris, one thing is I hear you talk through those things, and this fascinates me about politics, because when it comes to wanting to care for our kids and wanting to make sure people have enough to eat and making sure people feel secure and prosperous and happy, I don't think you have a lot of disagreement along political lines. I don't think there's a lot of people in politics. I don't really think there's anybody in politics that want people to be unhappy. That being said, it's hard, and like mental health access and suicide prevention, which is, I know, something you're passionate about, and I want to get into a little bit with you. But the bugaboo in this is, it's one thing to say, well, we need to provide all these additional services, we need to do these things, but then how do we pay for them? How do we, the public's ability to pay, or probably even more importantly than that, their willingness to pay for them. Because that's a reality where if they just don't want their taxes raised, you're not going to have the revenues to do them. So you're running in a very conservative state. You're running in an all Republican district right now. How do you balance those two things to say, I want to do all these things that I think would be really good for our community and our state and our people, with the reality that we also have to pay for them? And the taxpayers may be unwilling to go along with that.
Yeah, I think balance is exactly the right word. That's kind of my philosophy of leadership is having a foot in both worlds and your heart in the right place. So knowing that there are costs to every sort of decision that you make, and is it worth it? And what makes difficult decisions is when there are competing virtues that are both good, like being fiscally responsible as a government and providing for basic needs for people who need them, right? I think conservatives and progressives I think you're right. We agree that we want to help people. I think there can be just a line as to how much do we depend on individuals and churches and private institutions versus how much do we do together as a society, as a community, because of our relationship with each other. There are some things that we definitely are better off doing together, like fire stations, right? I mean, it'd be kind of silly to have each person sign up for their own individual fire service. We provide that. That's important. So we chip in for that. I think public education is another one of those things where we should all chip in for it. Whether or not you have a kid or a grandkid in public schools, you are in relationship with the rest of the community, and helping those kids helps you and the community. So I think part of ways that I would try to get at that is to explore that balance. Like, for example, when I was door knocking, a woman said that she likes the idea of universal school meals, but like, should we do it for everybody, even the people who can afford it? But she has a point. There's a balance there between what's fiscally responsible and what is, universal, so that you don't miss people. So it comes down to like, where do you find that balance? And I think having more progressive or Democratic members in the legislature can help provide that balance too. That was the other thing that when I was door knocking, one of my neighbors said that he's concerned about, the lack of balance in the government, that one party has kind of dominated things and tends to skew to one direction. And I think having a stronger voice to be able to moderate and to, even compromise, right, is to, not let perfect be
That's a dirty word. That's a dirty word these days.
I know.
Chris.
I just said it anyway. Not let perfect be the enemy of good, especially as a Democrat who is going to be in the minority party. I'm not going to be able to, push through very, very progressive things. But hopefully as a presence, there are some common sense stuff that we can do together, and to maybe even just sort of temper some of the vitriol maybe on the right and on the extreme left.
Chris, one of the themes Rob and Chad, when he's not on vacation, talk a lot about. It's a fleeting time when he's not on vacation, but you talk, Rob and Chad, about how our classrooms are kind of one of the fronts on the culture war. And it strikes me, Chris, that one of the emerging fronts is the exam room for doctors, nurses, providers, whether it's vaccines or transgender care or women's health care. My two-part question would be, are you seeing that in your practice? And then if you're elected as a legislator, how do you approach that issue, given your professional background?
Yeah, I do see that. Approximately maybe 20% of patients are a little vaccine hesitant. And so, we talk about that. I think the way that works best is to maintain that relationship with someone so that eventually, at some point, you ask for permission. Can we talk about this again? Where that gives you kind of the best chance. That's when I've had best success, where we've talked about vaccines, and then a couple visits later, they say, "Doc, which the most important vaccine we're going to get if we're going to get one?" Like, okay. So we talk about that, and we do one. That's a start. It's incremental. It's better than nothing. And maintaining that relationship is the way to do that. So I think, trying to get away from the idea that everything is just all transactional. I mean, there is a spectrum, I guess, between like how much of a relationship you have with someone versus how transactional it is. Like Uber, right? If you need to ride to the airport and you call an Uber, that's 100% transactional. That person does not know you from anything. They have to show up. But if you call your buddy and they like, I need you to take me to the airport at 5 a.m., that's a relational question. And if you're going to do it, it's because you have a relationship with that person. You're giving up a little bit of something for yourself for the greater good. And I think that we'll have that capacity, and that is certainly a way that we can continue to make progress.
Let's talk about mental health access and suicide prevention. One thing, North Dakota's got a problem with suicide in particular, and there's a lot of things we could talk about that. So much of our state is driven. It's a commodity-driven economy. Commodities swing up and down, and those economic fortunes can be hard. A lot of people live in rural communities, which can be isolating. It's difficult, but we're also seeing it even in like the judicial system. About a year or so ago, I had some articles about judges who were screaming out like they can't adjudicate cases against people accused of crime. So they can't, go about doing the people's business, the state of North Dakota versus whoever, because this person is struggling with mental health or maybe addiction issues, or more likely probably both. And they need to be brought competent so that they can be constitutionally competent to stand and participate in their defense. And they just can't get it done or can't get it done in a timely fashion. People are spending too much time incarcerated before they're even convicted of anything because we can't even get them through. And again, that sort of stuff is costly. And then even, I think, as Zach can probably speak to, even when the legislature makes funds available, who do we hire? Because hiring people with those skill sets and those jobs is hard right now. So give me some of your ideas. I mean, I think you've identified this is a problem. This is something we need to address. What are your ideas for addressing it?
Yeah, pipeline is definitely an issue. That's an issue for lots of different areas.
Pipeline, what do you mean by that?
So like getting people interested in careers in mental health.
Oh, gotcha.
And getting them through school and then staying and working. One of the ideas that other states have done is there's a pathway for like teachers who are already in a school who are interested in counseling and have a gift for that, getting them into an accelerated master's program so that they could become a counselor in their own school. They already know the kids. North Dakota does not have an adequate amount of school counselors. We're about 1 in 500 or so. And the recommendation from the school counselor board is about 1 in 350. So we're a little bit short. And I think that's part of the prevention, right? Is once you start to notice problems, have someone there who's a responsible and caring adult who can help intervene. That means screening for kids for anxiety and depression and office visits, which we do all the time. Integrating with mental health professionals in the clinic so that if I identify a problem, I can send them right to my colleague right away and be able to triage them into appropriate pathways for treatment and therapy. So I think those kinds of things, increasing the pipeline, you need to increase the supply. The demand for mental health is very high. So working on the supply side, so like loan repayments or other things like that are potential. We do that for our rural physicians. And I think it would be smart to prioritize that for our mental health providers too.
Shift, Chris, just you mentioned public education a little bit earlier. I expect that's going to be a pretty big issue in your race. One of your Republican opponents, I think she'd agree with the assessment. It's pretty closely aligned with school vouchers, educational savings account, some form of investing public dollars into private education. Do you see that as an important issue for District 41, and where do you stand on it?
Yeah, I think it's important. I think prioritizing public education is number one. That's our tax money, and it should go to serve the people, right? Just like I was talking about before with this, like if you had an independent fire department, let's say you wanted to hire a private fire department company, I don't think we should refund your tax money that would have gone to the fire department to help you pay for your own private fire department. So I think prioritizing, the public good with public money is the most important thing.
Let's talk a little bit about universal school meals. That's on the same ballot that the question of your candidacy is going to be on. We're going to have a statewide measure creating a constitutional amendment obligating the state to cover school meal fees. I like the idea. I don't love that it's going into the state constitution. I share our governor's concern about that. But that being said, how do you feel about the measure? How do you feel about that as an issue?
I think that's the best option we have. We had a chance during the regular legislative session for it to get passed. It didn't. And so taking it to the will of the people, I think is appropriate. Personally, the benefits of providing nutrition for our students improves their education, improves their well-being. We saw during COVID, when schools were closed, that there were many kids who, relied on their meals at school for their primary nutrition, and being able to provide that universally so that no kid gets left behind. I don't know if I should have said that, but I think is important. It's not missing anyone. And the fact that the constitutional measure would require us to pay for kids' meals first, I don't think that's a problem. I mean, why wouldn't we want to do that?
Yeah.
So I'm 100% in favor of it.
We're gonna talk about that aspect a little bit more, and I don't think it was the problem. I think it was more looking at a longer term issue. It's not that school meals themselves are an issue. I think our governor was supportive of it and would have signed that law if the legislators had sent it to his desk. They didn't. I think his problem is what if we have what if we keep mandating those sorts of spending obligations in the Constitution over and over and over again. I think that's his concern. That's my concern. But what else are you hearing from people as you're going door to door and you're knocking and you're listening to people? What are they telling you?
Yeah, I think people are really interested in having a choice and a voice. Before I agreed to run, there was nobody running in District 41 on the Dem NPL ticket. And that just doesn't seem right? There should be, you should have an opportunity to have a choice. And so at first I wasn't going to do this, but somebody had to do it. And it was time. So I think having at least that opportunity to be that moderating factor, like I mentioned before when I was door knocking with the man who was interested in balance, I think that is going to be super important and can be a great function of having a thoughtful, empathetic, and engaged minority party.
Apologies to whiplash us back to school meals after that answer, but I often find myself kind of nodding along in agreement with Rob when he talks about one of the big advantages of universal school meals. It's sort of a middle class targeted tax break,
Yes.
right, for families with kids in school. And I think sometimes the public conversation over leverages the hunger aspect, but I want to give you an opportunity to sort of course correct me on that one. As a provider, are you seeing growing concerns about undernourished kids, families dealing with hunger? We've got new numbers out from some national groups this week that the SNAP cuts from the big beautiful bill are maybe a little steeper and coming faster even than the Congressional Budget Office was estimating. I think I saw something like 5,000 fewer SNAP benefit recipients in North Dakota since July of last year now. What do you see, boots on the ground as a provider?
Yeah, definitely. At our clinic and our urgent care, we do routine screening for food insecurity, and we have an emergency food pantry that we're able to distribute food from our clinics and then be able to get them resources and referrals so that they can engage with the other food banks. And it is every day that we are sending bags of food home with families who need it, especially now with the cost of everything, kind of going through the roof, fuel and everything else, groceries. So I think, it is real. It does happen. It may be kind of more invisible than we think just because people are proud and they maybe don't want to, make it obvious that that they rely on assistance. And I think you're right also from a middle class, tax relief standpoint. Again, people are thinking, well, does everybody need that? The wealthiest people, do they need to have this? But, we don't means test the property tax rebate. That goes to people who own property. It doesn't necessarily go to people who rent their homes, right? And those people are actually still paying property tax in a way because the cost of everything is built into their rent, just like insurance for the building and all that. So, up to potentially $1,000 per family per year can be saved. And that would certainly be very helpful. I mean, that's 40 gallons of gas or something like that. 50 gallons of gas for working in middle income families. All around, I think it's an excellent idea.
Yeah, that was one of when the issue came out during past legislative sessions, I heard all my liberal friends talking about the hunger side of it. And I don't mean to dismiss that at all, but I was like, well, I'm a conservative. This is a tax cut for families with school-age children. You have to pay for this. You have to send your kids to school. Compulsory education's been the law for a long, long time. And and then you have to pay this fee when you send them. And a lot of people qualify for free or reduced lunch. A lot of people who struggle. Your household income, by the way, is not a perfect indicator of whether or not your household is struggling or whether or not you have some things going on that may be difficult. So just because you fall outside of that doesn't mean you're doing well. Doesn't mean you're doing good. Doesn't mean everything's hunky-dory in your world. So I am worried about the constitutional part of it. But we are where we're at, as a friend of mine once famously said. Let me talk to you about this. You're running as a Democrat in a district that's electing Republicans in a state that doesn't like Democrats very much. All apologies, Zach. It's a reality, and people shouldn't vote.
A city that just elected a Democratic mayor.
Fair enough. Boy, you knocked me completely off my line of thought on that. Like it or not, there are a lot of voters in North Dakota, particularly when it comes to partisan office, and they vote party line. They shouldn't. I wish they would stop, but they do. And so how do you, the Democratic brand, not great in a lot of parts of North Dakota. How do you overcome that? How do you win over vote? You're going to need people who have been voting Republican to vote for you if you're going to win this election.
100%.
How do you do that?
I need people who are usually Republicans to donate for me too. I think being a temporizing is not the right word, but being who I am and having the values that represent, like, science, common sense, being nice to people, doing the right thing. I think that's for everybody. And the climate and the political winds in the country are maybe, swinging a little bit one direction more so than the other based on national things. And so that if it comes down to, North Dakota having to fend for itself, then, we need people who are going to do the right thing for North Dakota and look out for our neighbors.
I think Democrats in North Dakota do best when you localize issues, as opposed. I think if a race gets nationalized, more often than not, you guys lose, because it's especially that national Democratic brand that's talk. So how do you keep focus local? How do you keep it on District 41? How do you keep it on Fargo? How do you keep it on North Dakota?
Yeah, it's talking to folks and finding out, what priorities. That's one of the things I say when I'm door knocking. I give them my literature, list my big things, public education, healthy kids, mental health, healthy economy, that kind of stuff. And I say, well, what other issues do you think I should be paying attention to? And that's where I hear things about balance and just getting back to being nice and being neighborly. That's not necessarily a red or a blue thing. That's just a person thing. And I think, being a Democrat, I do align more on that left side of the center, and that's okay. And I think it's more about how are you going to be as a human? Same thing as a physician, right? You can be the smartest person in the world and know every little detailed fact, right? And you also need to be able to be a human with your patients and comfort them and be a healer and not just a technician. So I think that, my ability to be a healer instead of just a technician, I think will help mitigate maybe, some baggage that goes with a blue label and Democratic name behind me.
And Chris, how are you finding that experience being a candidate, right? In this era of term limits, we're going to need more and more folks to raise their hand and say, yeah, I'll volunteer to do this. But I bet as a physician, you haven't done a lot of fundraising in your professional life. You haven't been much of a content creator like you got to be now. You haven't made a lot of house calls probably in the area you practice in. So is it invigorating? Is it difficult? What are your thoughts?
It's fun. I like learning new things. And this is definitely a new skill and a new way to help. And it's fascinating. I think, figuring this out and finding a new way to kind of go into the next phase. I mean, I just turned 59 yesterday, and I'm definitely in that phase of my career where I'm thinking about, what do I leave behind? I obviously have my kids, my family, but what kind of impact can I leave on North Dakota that's given me so much? From being a public school student in Grand Forks and graduating from Red River, going to med school at UND, I owe a lot to North Dakota and North Dakotans, and this is, I think, is a new way for me to explore that service and to be a voice.
Well, that's Dr. Chris Tiongson, candidate for the State House, Fargo-area District 41. Thank you for coming on, sir.
All right, thank you.
Every child is unique, and every family deserves the freedom to choose the education that works best for them. Americans for Prosperity North Dakota supports policies that empower parents with more educational options, including education savings accounts, public charter schools, and open enrollment. When funding follows the students, parents have more options to choose the education that fits their child's needs. Connect and learn more at afpnd.org.
Today's program is sponsored by the North Dakota Association of Rural Electric Cooperatives, representing locally owned electric co-ops that power homes, farms, and businesses across rural North Dakota. Electric cooperatives are committed to reliable, affordable energy and strengthening the communities they serve. Learn more at ndarec.com. Hey, Plain Talk listeners, have something to say? Call or text Plain Talk with your questions, comments, or headlines you want us to cover.
Just dial 701-587-3141. Leave us your message or shoot us a text with your name and location, and you could be featured on an upcoming show.
Hi, my name is Ashley, and I am in Jamestown.
Hey, Rob and Chad. My name's Tony. I live in Grand Forks.
That's 701-587-3141.
Call us, text us, vent, praise.
We want you in the conversation. Thanks for being part of the show.
Now let's get back to today's episode.
Zach, I thought the best question you asked during that interview was about how he's finding it as a candidate. I will tell you that I am very, very worried about term limits, which are a factor now, and coupled with the reality of what it's like to run a campaign, where it can be this absolutely bruising gauntlet. Running for public office was never easy when you have the scrutiny of the news media and everything else. It's always can be a rough business, but I feel like it's rougher than ever before because everybody you talked about a candidate being a content creator. Everybody on social media thinks they're a content creator and they're all doing stuff, and so I'm worried that we're going to be term limiting out people who are running for office now. So legally, you can't run for this office anymore. So we're going to need a constant crop of newcomers, but how many good candidates are going to want to subject themselves to this process? I'm worried about it. So I'm glad to hear that Dr. Tiongson having a good experience so far. But yeah, I'll tell you, I'm worried about that.
From the Democratic side of politics in North Dakota, it is hard to get people to raise their hands. And we're oftentimes asking people to raise their hand in a district where we just know as a matter of political fact, they're going to get 25% of the vote in a two-person race. So it's difficult. And I think there's a few districts where Republicans have that same challenge in North Dakota. But it's going to come for the majority party too, as we, cycle through fewer and fewer options to run for the seat. And it is very difficult in this age of social media, right? It's a little tongue in cheek to say you're a content creator, but you have to be. You have to get your name out there. It used to be you could buy a couple of mailers, a couple of ads, and that was about it. Walk in the parade in town, and that was your campaign. But now if you're not on Facebook and TikTok and Instagram, nobody knows who you are. And it's such a different skill set than it is to be a legislator, right? Dr. Tiongson really speaks my language as a candidate, not as a Democrat, but as in the way he seems to be approaching the job, right? Unless he's really hiding it from us, he's not just a culture warrior or firebrand. He wants to go there to be balanced, to compromise, to do what's right for his district and the state. And those aren't the people that are necessarily attracted to the role of candidate, right? That's not what gets clicks in this day.
And also, it's not sometimes who voters are drawn for to get really fired up about and really enthusiastic about. We tend to like firebrands, and on the right that means somebody who's coming in and we're going to slash and burn government, and the bureaucrats are all crooks, and we're going to cut taxes, and we're going to do all this stuff, and they don't spend any time on the nuance of, well, what if we cut all that spending, how are we going to deal with these problems? How are we going to keep roads paved? How are we going to make sure that if somebody's having a mental health crisis, there are resources available? How are we going to make sure that we're efficiently adjudicating criminal charges against people? On the other side, we get liberals sometimes who come in and we're going to do all this. So it's going to be free housing and we're going to provide all these new government services. And they don't ask themselves, well, what about the public's willingness to pay for these things? What about the impacts on taxes? And if we take money from one pot and give it to the other, how do we replace where we took from? I don't really think I really liked Dr. Tiongson. And again, I mean, he's left of center. I'm right of center. That he's probably not, if I lived in District 41, that's probably not who I'd vote for. But I'm very encouraged to hear a candidate talking about, yes, I understand there has to be a balance. Yes, I understand that if my conservative friends come to me and say, what you're proposing is too expensive and we can't pay for it, I'm not immediately going to think that they're bad people for making that argument, because it's a valid argument. And that part of the debate matters too.
Yeah, and it's encouraging to hear he's getting that feedback from the voters he's talking to, that balance in and of itself is a consideration voters are making, right? I think candidate quality and sort of that disposition ought to matter to voters just as much as the party label.
Normally, I would be not dismissive, but I would maybe be a little bit hesitant when a candidate says, I'm really hearing people talking, calling for balance. Of course, when you're a Democrat running in a supermajority Republican state, balance is what you want. But I think there's some credence to it when we look at the primary we just had. When you look at the Republican primary, I mean, we had a lot of competitive races on the Republican side, and the side that won was kind of the more moderate side, was kind of the more focused on issues side, more focused on, and not that they're not ideological, and not that they're not conservatives or what have you, but there was a lot of rejection for people who were really focused on firebrand issues, really focused on, culture war stuff, things that might really fire up the voters, but aren't really important priorities in terms of public policy. That was a very encouraging primary we just had, I thought. And maybe it really does indicate where the voters are at.
And I think it reflects the general electorate in District 41 specifically. I think by North Dakota standards, that qualifies as a purple district.
Pretty moderate,
President Trump won it only by single digits in 2024. I served with Pam Anderson, a Democrat in the House from that district. So there's absolutely a chance to win over voters with that common sense. I mean, I look at outgoing Representative Karen Grinberg, right? She was appointed to the seat, but she's not somebody who's just there to yell and scream. Kyle Davison's had a long career out of that district of sort of branding himself as a problem solver more than an ideologue. So, I think Dr. T reflects his district, and that's sort of mission number one for any candidate.
Obviously, Dr. T very, very passionate about the school meals issue, and we got some interesting news. And I heard a lot of confusion from people because during the special session earlier this year, our governor was very focused on the school meals issue. He released polling on it to me, showing that it's an 80-20 issue. This is something North Dakotans want. He made it very clear that if the legislature sent him a statutory bill to implement school meals, that he would sign it into law. So he is in favor of the policy, but what he said recently is that he would vote against the constitutional measure. In his argument, which I happen to agree with, although I don't think it's going to rise to the level for me for not voting for it. But I am very, very worried about our initiated measure process and what it means. I am worried about locking spending into the state constitution, obligating the state to do more and more spending. I'm worried about how easy it is. I mean, as much as I like and respect the people behind the school meals measure, they bought their signatures. They were able on a very short timeline to collect a lot of signatures because they dumped a lot of money into paid petitioners, which shows that if you have money, you can buy your way onto the ballot. And while in this case, I think it's a benign thing, I think their proposal is good, and I don't question their motives or anything like that, but other people can do the same thing. And then I worry about the Supreme Court ruling that we just had, where they came down and said, it is lawful to include in a ballot measure, and in this instance, it was the term limits ballot measure, so a constitutional amendment. It is lawful to put in there that the legislature is not allowed to legislate once this is locked in, and the only way to amend it is another ballot measure. And what I worry about, I look at a place like California, where I think the referendum process, the initiated measure process of California has made a mess of their state in a lot of ways, and I don't want that to come here. I think there is a point at which I am concerned about, powerful groups locking spending, locking their priorities in, and then locking it away from reform at the ballot box. That scares me, Zach.
Yeah, I don't want to become, the California model of Prop, 2012 every election we have, but I think we're a long ways away from that. I think the bigger risk is that a supermajority legislature is that powerful entity that, as we've seen with school meals, sometimes gets out of step with the will of a substantial majority of the voters. I'll get back to the politics of sort of where Governor Armstrong was in this. I think on the merits, it's not as constitutionally novel, as you might think at first blush. We have many provisions in the Constitution that already obligate where revenue sources must be directed, right? The part of the coal severance tax goes
We're required to fund schools.
We're required to fund schools. Legacy fund being the most, obvious example. The oil extraction tax must go to this dedicated fund. So in many ways, obligating spending and what comes first is sort of just the flip side of that same coin. And I think almost everybody would be in agreement, Rob, that in a perfect world, this would be in statute, not in a constitution. But as I keep hearing that complaint and about the term limits, I've kind of dubbed it this constitutional clincher, right? That we're going to put this in the Constitution. The legislature can never bring a measure to propose changing it. I'm reminded of that meme that goes around the internet. There's that sketch comedy show where the guy drives his hot dog shaped car into the wall and then he pops out wearing his hot dog costume. He says, "We're all looking for the guy who did this." I think that's kind of the problem with those grumbling about it here, right? The legislature had multiple attempts to codify school meals. It didn't. The term limits proponents put this clincher language in their measure, and what was the legislative response? Immediately to try to change it. I think they're looking pretty prescient in that they needed to stop the legislature.
Yeah, but I think we also make
that.
some assumptions about public opinion there. I don't think the voters voted for the clincher language. I don't think most of them, if you ask them, probably didn't even know that was in there. I don't know that they realized that they were even passing it. So to say that represents the will of the people, does it? I mean, I guess they voted for the measure, but how many of them read the whole thing? I'm not convinced that a lot of them did. And the other problem is you say, well, the legislature, they're ignoring the people, so all these things had to happen. But those legislators aren't having many problems getting reelected. There hasn't been many challenges to the supermajority for a while. So again, those are mixed messages. It's not as clear, like one-to-one, like this is the defense. We have to have this process because the legislature ignores the people. And I think, yeah, sure, on an issue-by-issue basis, you could say sometimes that's true. But also, those guys are getting reelected, and that's the will of the people, too.
It certainly is. It certainly is. And it's always tough to figure out what individual issues rise to that level of salience where somebody's like, I'm not only going to vote for this as a standalone issue, I'm going to vote for this to take away your job because it's that important to me. And, I tend to think voters are better at some of that nuance maybe than others do on that issue of term limits. I don't think it was a confusing ballot measure. I think they got what they asked for. And, honestly, the electorate continues to have that power to initiate change itself. If they don't think the term limits are working, we can do the whole petition signature again and change it that way.
Yeah.
But that does run headlong into some of these, I think, principled stands of what is the role of a state constitution versus state statute? What is the role of a ballot initiative process? I think by and large, North Dakota's voters have shown themselves to be pretty judicious about this. Even though some of the things you've pointed out, it is a relatively easy state to infuse some outside money into and maybe use it as a testing ground for some national priority. But by and large, North Dakota voters haven't gone down that road.
We have a term limits amendment because a Washington, D.C. based group called U.S. Term Limits paid to buy signatures to put it on the ballot because they want to challenge a 1995 Supreme Court precedent that struck down. And really more the challenge is the age limits because they backed the age limits ballot measure. So that's more where they want to challenge the Supreme Court's precedent on whether that the states can set the terms by which Congress serves. The term limits in North Dakota weren't for Congress; they were for state officials, which is perfectly constitutional. But I don't know. I feel like a lot of times maybe people would be singing a different tune. Right now, a lot of these ballot measures are maybe going in the direction that people on the left like. I think if you saw a national right-wing group, Americans for Tax Reform or something, come in and say, we're going to eliminate the income tax, and we're going to pay $800,000 to gather signatures, and we're going to drown the legislators out with this massive media marketing campaign. Look what we saw with Marzy's Law. Marzy's Law is terrible policy. But, again, they paid to collect their signatures. They paid to get Kelsey Grammer on everybody's television, making the case for it. And now we have Marzy's Law, which is a pain in the tuchus, has not really done a lot to benefit North Dakota. But people passed it. And by the way, very, very complicated law in all its nuances. And we passed it at the ballot box and now we're stuck with it. I don't think that's a good way to make policy.
I'd offer a couple of counterpoints. And, I think there's a fair amount of national out-of-state money that has attempted multiple times to legalize recreational marijuana in the state. And the voters said no. And, you are right. Sometimes you have situational viewpoints on whether ballot measures are good or not. I'm not a fan of the single subject ballot measure that just passed, but it passed. And then the voters got their say. And I think it's sort of one of the rights of voters in a state like North Dakota that sometimes they get to choose policy I disagree with. And we're going to live with that.
Yeah, I'm not arguing with democracy, but I think process matters. I think the way we go about it matters. And I'm one of those in the proud American tradition of being very suspicious of direct democracy. Our founders certainly were. I think we need protections against it, and I don't think we have enough of those protections. If I had my way, I would take the initiated measure parts of the law, I would ball it up into a ball and throw it in the garbage where it belongs. But that's me, and that's a very minority viewpoint. Most people aren't going to take that position. I do think we need some more. I hope the 60% threshold that's going to be on the November ballot, I hope that passes.
And I'm strongly opposed to that as well. And for a couple
why?
of
When we amend the
reasons.
U.S. Constitution, it requires supermajorities. You know, what's wrong with the supermajority
Sure. Well,
when it comes to amending the Constitution?
One of my objections is the irony that we'd be able to institute a 60% threshold by just a simple majority.
You got to play by the rules that are on the table.
Well, we could do it in a two-step, right? We could do a 50% plus one threshold to say all future changes require a supermajority. And then let's see where the will of voters is. And two, I lived through a legislative session where the notion of Fargo for its city elections doing approval or ranked choice voting was just far too confusing, far too violative of the, first past the post voting. I don't like
approval voting is very confusing. A supermajority is not. This is a very common.
I think the most votes should win. I think it's kind of offensive to the voters that a Bismarck school referendum loses with 57, 58% of the vote.
I would go the other direction, like the Bismarck school referendum. I don't think those should require 60 votes. But again, that's not the Constitution. I think if we're talking about the Constitution, I don't think a 60% threshold is unreasonable.
No, I think there's some merit to it. I think North Dakota's generally taken a slightly different approach with its state constitution, where it is not quite the static document that the United States Constitution is. We have sort of used it as a super statute more than maybe a traditional constitution.
That's where we have some disagreement about what's appropriate to be in the Constitution and what should be in statute. Maybe it's a subjective thing, and we're going to find out where the voters are on that. I do get tired though of this, a lot of chest beating about the initiated measure process, where it's like it's these powerful interests that are trying to steal from the people. And I look at the people who are backing these ballot measures, and I'm like, they're not powerful interests. These organizations have hundreds of thousands of dollars to drop on paid petitioners. That's not exactly the citizen-led campaigns that we're supposed to think of when we think of this. That typically doesn't happen. Most of the ballot measure campaigns are not that. They're professional activists, professional consultants pouring a ton of money into very sophisticated campaigns to try to get their measures across the ballot. The idea that this is a citizen-run process is not borne out by the fact. It could be, but that's not usually the case.
Yeah, that's why that single subject measure on the primaries was pretty interesting, right? I'm not aware of any massive...
I was shocked that passed. I'm glad it did.
I was pretty surprised it passed too. I think just generally without, paid persuasion campaign, the no bias wins out on these. But
you lawmakers do that, and I shouldn't point the finger at you specifically, but the legislature's terrible about putting things like that on the ballot and then doing no messaging whatsoever to make the affirmative case.
Well, and I think it'd also be inappropriate to use any sort of public funds to do that. But
I mean, like organize something, right? I mean,
right.
I'm not saying spend tax dollars.
It was kind of a nice democratic experiment to see what happens if you just put a ballot measure out there and let the voters read it and decide.
Yeah. It's a hard issue. I like, and by the way, there are parts of it I like. I like the referendum process. I like the idea of the voters having a veto. So if it's something that they just find completely odious, they could grab it. I think that's what would have happened to that school choice bill if Governor Armstrong hadn't vetoed it. I think what would have happened is that would have gotten referred to the ballot, and I think the voters would have rejected it because that measure, it cost a lot of money to benefit a very small number of people. So I like the idea of the veto. I support referendums. I just don't like the idea of legislating at the ballot box. And if we're going to have the process, I think it should be harder. And I think it should be less vulnerable to who has the most money that can shove one of these things through.
And I think that question of money is where you and I would find common cause, but I would probably extend it to our broader election, our election framework of we don't seem to care as much when that money comes from out of state for statewide office holders or legislative districts. And maybe we should, or maybe we shouldn't. But yeah, the role of money in determining who wins elections or which issues win elections is a huge part of the national conversation.
Yeah. Again, and I think it's just, maybe it's just an expectation. But again, when we think of initiated measure process, we're supposed to be thinking about these volunteer, citizen-led. More than likely, the person who's asking you to sign that petition is being paid and probably doesn't care about that petition much one way or the other. They're getting paid to circulate it, and that's it. And that's the reality of how this works. And I think that stinks. But
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, we probably
transition
beat
away
that issue
from,
into the earth. You disagree with me, but that's fine. That's fine. And I should mention this is going to be the topic of my TED Talk speech next week. And I guess, as a little bit of housekeeping, we will have a podcast next week. We're going to be recording live from the TED Talk event in Fargo. I'm going to be speaking at the event. I've been getting my speech ready and everything. I am so nervous about it, Zach. I feel like I'm going to barf most of the time. Greg Tavine, who talked me into doing this, texted me this morning talking about how excited he was to see me down there. I wanted to text him back something intemperate for getting me into this thing. I don't want to do it, Zach.
Well, I've known Greg Tavine since we were in first grade together, and he's very good at getting people to do that which they might not
He's
otherwise
a devious
want
sucker,
to do.
I'll
So
tell you.
you'll do just fine. I'm sure it'll go viral. You'll be like, one of those famous TED talkers. Now you'll just get to go on the whole circuit nationwide.
You think so? I don't think that's going to be true at all. I think I'm going to get up there and I'm going to tell everybody how we need to be as skeptical of the electorate as we are about the government. And I mean, I guess just in a little preview, like, I'm not anti-democratic. I believe in representative government. I don't believe that much in direct democracy. That gives me pause. And the reason for that is I think sometimes like some of our most important issues, the civil rights issue. I mean, just because something is popular doesn't mean it's right. In Mississippi at one point in time, Jim Crow was the law of the land. And it was the law of the land because it was popular. The people wanted it. And they were wrong. They were absolutely wrong about that. And it took some anti-democratic processes to set things right. The court stepped in, right, to set things right in the South. So, I like that. I like a system that has checks and balances. I have where it's not just a majoritarian rule, because majoritarian rule, when it comes to free speech, we don't have the First Amendment to protect popular speech. We don't have the First Amendment to protect Bison football broadcasts. Nobody has a problem with that. We have the First Amendment to protect plain talk when we say things that people maybe don't like or wish that we would shut up about things. We're allowed to express some popular points of view. I'm allowed to go on a TED Talk stage and rail against the initiated measure process, even though it's very popular in our state, because the First Amendment protects me. And that's an anti-democratic. I mean, the First Amendment in that way is kind of anti-democratic, in which it says it doesn't matter how many people hate what you're saying, you're still allowed to say it, and you cannot be punished for it.
And then the irony being, if enough people wanted to make a change to the First Amendment, I suppose we go through that entire
every part of the law. But you know what that would require, Zach? A supermajority.
Supermajority of states and the houses of Congress.
Isn't it great when we protect our Constitution with supermajority?
It definitely is for fundamental rights, civil rights, human rights. Maybe for things like term limits, we can have a lower standard.
Yeah. Maybe term limits should be in statute, not the Constitution.
I think any mom and pop that collected signatures for term limits would probably find the same success as a big national outfit.
You think so? Maybe.
Yeah. If they had enough time, they didn't have to worry about getting him in.
It's really hard. I mean, it is a hard, and that is one of the, I will admit, that is one of the confounding things, because one of the things I don't think that process should be as easy as it is. The problem is you make it harder. The people with the resources are still going to be able to do it. The people with the deep pockets, you make it harder. The people you're making it the hardest on are probably the true volunteers, who maybe want to organize a campaign. We really don't see many of those anymore. But
right, I think somebody got permission or authorization to circulate signatures for something on window tinting on cars, right? And
they just went nowhere.
Not really getting off the ground, because I think you realize maybe that's not an issue a lot of people care about, or I don't, as an individual, have the time and financial resources to gather those thousands of signatures.
It's a lot of work. All right. Yeah. Like I said, next week, it's going to be a little weird with the podcast, so we might not be on our usual release schedule. We will have a show next week and Chad Oban will be back in the driver's seat. We're going to lure him back from his eternal vacationing to do a little work here on Plain Talk. I kid. It's such a gift to have Chad, and I give him so much crap. But at his age, I mean, it's really important that he takes time off.
He's sort of like the inverse of the National Guard. They're 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year. That's the schedule he works. 2 weeks a year, 1 week in a
that's
month.
exactly right. That's exactly how it is. All right. PlainTalkND.com is the place to go. That's our YouTube channel. Great way. If you subscribe, you can get the new videos on your phone. You can see clips from the show if you just want to watch some highlights. We have breakdowns from the interviews, from topics. We have the, remember, WDY Extra on weeknights at 5:30 p.m. You can watch the show. We have the version that we cut up for that on there. So that's going to be fun. Also, Plain Talk ND, all of our social media apps, Instagram, X, Facebook. Plain Talk ND is our handle. 701-587-3141. If you want to send us a text about something you heard on the show, if you want to send us a voicemail, we pretty much put all of those on. There's a few I can't put on because they really use some language that I'm just not comfortable broadcasting, even on the internet. So be polite.
First Amendment.
Yeah, even with the first. Well, the thing is, I'm not covered by the First Amendment. It's my show. I can decide what goes on. We're pretty even-handed, though. If you want to roast us, if you want to say we're doing great, whatever you want to say, just be a modicum of politeness. You'll make it.
Yeah, just leave the guest host alone.
And leave the guest host alone. Be nice to Zach. Zach is setting sail for the private sector now, no longer going to be a public official. He doesn't have to take the slings and arrows of public disdain anymore. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again. That's it for today on Plain Talk, the voice of North Dakota politics. Plain Talk is a production of Forum Communications Company. Got a question, comment, or suggestion? Leave us a voicemail or send us a text message at 701-587-3141. That's 701-587-3141. If you haven't subscribed to Plain Talk yet, you can find us on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. For those of you who are already hooked, give us a rating or review. And don't forget to share or tell a friend. Special thanks to my co-host Chad Oban, and from myself and everyone at Plain Talk, thanks for listening. He's the lamest of lame ducks.
The North Dakota oil and natural gas industry works here, and works here, and here, and even works here by creating 60,000 jobs statewide and generating billions of tax dollars annually to support our infrastructure, flood protection projects, and our schools. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities.
Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org.
This episode is presented by the Blue Rider.
Check out the Blue Rider in downtown Minot for a laid-back vibe and outdoor patio and 16 beers on tap.
They've got live music, trivia nights, and one of the deepest record collections around.
Plus fair prices, friendly faces, late-night favorites like grilled cheese and pizza.
The Blue Rider, serving Minot since 1994.
Good drinks, good music, good people.
This episode is presented by Recovery Centers of Montana.
If you or someone you know is struggling, getting help shouldn't feel out of reach.
Recovery Centers of Montana offers care across 6 locations, including inpatient facilities and outpatient clinics.
Step away from the noise and focus on getting your life back on track.
Learn more by calling 701-401-3000.
That's 701-401-3000.